Hi, Lorine. Hi, Karim.
Hey.
Hi.
How are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you all?
Good, thanks.
Well,
I'm excited to be here, and I'm excited to talk about such an important topic. I think I'll kick it off by doing introductions of both of you all. So, Karim and then Lorine, if you could just give a 30-second overview, who you are, what you do, and why you're here. I think the audience would really enjoy learning a little bit more about your stories.
Okay, great, we'll do.
sure. Lorraine, you want to go first? You want me to jump in?
Sure. Why don't you go first?
Okay, cool. Well, I'm Karim Webb. I'm the CEO of Fourth Movement. Fourth Movement was stood up to really help people take advantage or excel given the opportunity that was set aside licensing and social equity programming in Los Angeles. And so we've been somewhat successful in that process. We have currently 13, what we think will end up being about 20 of our social equity partners standing up a retail concept here in Los Angeles in really competitive locations. And Fourth Movement finds folks that qualify and vets and trains, and then helps people have all of the tools necessary to compete at the highest level, and 100% finances, all of it in order to make that happen. And then, helps folks with the HR and the accounting and the supply chain management and all of the things you have to do to compete at the highest level in retail. And so that's what we do, at Fourth Movement, and intend to do so, in other markets other than Los Angeles.
Thank you, Karim. I'm going to hand the mic virtually over to Lorine, if you could give a bit of a brief intro.
Great, thanks. I'm Lorine Pendleton. I am investment partner in Portfolio Rising America Fund. It's a fund, diversity fund, actually. We invest in companies where at least one founder is diverse or LGBTQ, or products and services that would cater or high over-index in those markets. To date, we've invested in 3 companies. We'll probably invest in another 7 to 8 companies. A fintech company focused on, it's a mobile bank focused on the unbankables, which are 88 million people in the United States are either don't have a bank account or underbanked. Half of those are people of color. Also a telehealth company we've invested in as well for women who are having kids. It provides telehealth services in 22 languages. And then our last investment is a edutainment company, which is a platform, online platform, as well as books to teach kids to be bilingual. We're really looking at investing in companies that are solving a huge problem, which impacts people of color. Have a great investment team. We're the first fund that's led by a team of all Black and Latino women, first in the country, led by VC Fund, and we're looking for really just great, amazing deals. We have not invested in the cannabis space, but we're certainly open to it.
Well, after this conference, I'm sure you and your entire team will be job to do so. So, I want to kick off the first question by asking something that I'm sure you get very often, and that's, what's the business case for investing in a diverse sort of pool of entrepreneurs and leaders in your own sort of practices, and then what's sort of the broader sort of ethical or social case for it? You can start with the business case. Maybe Lorine, you can kick it off, and then we'll.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Well, I mean, if you just look at data, the United States is going to become a majority minority, and by 2046, people say. And so, if you're a company particularly a consumer type of company, if you're not marketing and thinking about how the United States is going to change, you're basically at a competitive disadvantage. And so, from a business standpoint, these are markets, big markets. If you combine these markets, the diverse market and LGBTQ, it's a $7 trillion annual spend market. So the size of some countries, many countries. And then the other thing is, when we look at these companies that are diverse-led, because the fact that only 1% actually of African-American-led companies get any kind of VC funding. it's about 1.5% Latino companies. So, but the companies that we see who've actually like bootstrapped it, who are doing well, are post revenue, they've had to be incredibly capital efficient. So they're kind of, A-list, high performing founders. And so, we look at them as being great opportunities. And then also, unfortunately, a lot of those companies' evaluation isn't as high if you were to take a company that's led by a white male or another type of founders. And so from purely like we're able to get more equity, we're of course not being predatory, but if you look at those companies, they tend to have lower valuations, so we can get more equity. And like I said, I think these are high performing entrepreneurs, and so from a business standpoint it makes sense. And then also just don't you want everyone in this country to do well and not just one group of people? So that's something that, from a social standpoint is important, but also from a business standpoint, it's important.
Yeah, those stats are astounding. And while I don't think we're at the level of maturity for the cannabis industry to break those out, I can only imagine they're even more disparate in terms of funding and leadership. Karim, you are one of sort of the few, Black, CEOs in the regulated cannabis market, and you're doing incredibly well. What would you say is the business case for, your leadership in this space as well as for the fourth movement model?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I just want to commend Lorine and how she broke down the case, because I think that's everything that I couldn't agree more. The one thing that I would add is that there's a level of cultural competency and, African American culture for sure, is the most prominent culture commercially around the world. When you talk about television and film and music and fashion, so it moves the needle. And we don't own it, but it moves the needle by and large. And so also funding African American founders, you are tapping into, people who come from a culture who, have really led taste around the world too. And I think that matters in terms of attractiveness of a concept or a product or a service. In the cannabis space, also to Lorine's point, we've experienced over 65% of the negative ramifications of criminal justice around cannabis, and we control less than 1% of the licenses. And in cannabis, it's a limited license opportunity. I'm a Buffalo Wild Wings franchisee. Anybody can come open a Wingstop, right across the street from me, or any other kind of wing joint that they want. In cannabis, it's a limited opportunity because jurisdiction, states, whatever, control the opportunity to do business. So that creates value for shareholders in and of itself, because you are doing business, in a much more tightly regulated space, which de-risks, or at least should de-risk an investment. And then again, you've got these set aside licensing programs, which ought to create additional opportunity for investors to partner with people who qualify for these limited opportunity licenses to do business. The question is whether or not the industry is going to attract the kind of acumen and kind of business capability necessary for folks to compete at the highest level. It's also a very difficult business in which to compete because of the regulatory environment, the kind of specialized taxes, 280E, and those sorts of things. So you've got to have a concept that really works, and you are up against an industry by and large that certainly isn't, by us, for us, and has been the first mover. So got all the medical licenses and are the quote unquote MSO, the multi-state operators, typically vertically integrated. And so you've got to be able to navigate in kind of like, let's just call it like the big company world, and still be successful with and really understanding supply chain, whether you're on the cultivation, manufacturing, distribution, or retail side. You really have got to know business backwards and forwards in order to be successful here.
No, that makes a lot of sense. For people who are less familiar with the cannabis space, it is probably arguably the most highly regulated space in the country, more so than like the plutonium reserves here. So making sure that the business chops are there is a struggle, which is why the fourth movement model is so great, because you're really teaching people how to fish in a real way and giving them the capital and business resources necessary to do so. So you all both touched on something that I find really interesting, and I think will be interesting to our audience. I know there are quite a few people who are coming from more traditional luxury sort of categories, and that is the influence of Black or a diverse sort of cultural perspective on a lot of these consumer products, whether they be cannabis or whatnot. And I'm curious, as you sort of worked in your different spheres, have you found that cultural competency has been particularly beneficial for the business? And if so, why? And if not, like, do you think there's a communication or a lack of understanding about how valuable that particular competency is with investors or with the media? Lorine, I'll kick it to you, and then we'll go back to Karim.
So, I mean, I think I'm speaking outside of cannabis because I have an investment in cannabis. I mean, I'm familiar with it, but haven't made an investment in that space. But, you know, our founders are pretty much all our founders are people of color. And what's really interesting is that, so take the mobile banking, Mochify, the banking company. You know, he was an executive, JP Morgan Chase, had a cushy job, but he saw that this was a huge issue, that there are all these people in this country who don't have bank accounts. And he told us a stat, which is phenomenal, that over the lifetime of African American, you know, someone who doesn't have a bank account, they spend $40,000 more than their white counterpart on banking services by going to check cashing places. I mean, that's incredible. And so he identified that there was a problem. And so I think it's important that, you know, we support founders of color, or even if you have a company and you're not a founder of color, you bring in people with different perspectives, because they're able to identify problems that you may not see and see, you know, have you avoid blind spots, and then also come to the table with different solutions that you may not see because you may have a blind spot. And so endless studies have shown, like from McKinsey to Boston Consulting Group, that if you have companies, diverse-led companies where it's not homogeneous, not everyone's like a white male, those companies actually outperform companies where everyone is the same. And so, you know, it's an imperative, a business imperative, if you want to be successful, to bring in, you know, different people that they can provide cultural competency, can identify issues and problems, and come up with great solutions that you may overlook. So, you know, I think from that standpoint, it's really important.
Definitely. You don't know what you don't know. And everyone has a very different life experience that have problems that need solving and need sort of products and companies to do that. Karim, you know, you mentioned that African American culture has been sort of inextricably tied with cannabis culture, for better and for worse, as we all are unfortunately very aware. I'm curious, in the cannabis space, is having that sort of background, especially with your sort of franchisees, has that been beneficial towards creating better products or services?
Well, we're pre-revenue, so we won't start getting our first stores open to the end of the year, right? And so, you know, I think that my experience, you know, in Buffalo Wild Wings, like leadership and franchise leadership, and working with Boston Consulting Group and all of these, you know, big firms, certainly informed how we stood up our retail concept and you know, how we're going about our go-to-market strategy, really our entire business model, for sure. But there's, you know, again, with the limited license opportunity, I'll tell you where some of the disconnects have been in our experience. One being African American man, having grown up in an entrepreneurial household, with, you know, my folks having had a lot of employees, there's cultural competency with respect to, you know, driving ourselves to the results necessary to compete. Right. So many of us come from backgrounds that we've experienced so much trauma. Hell, being African American in the United States is traumatic in and of itself. No matter how much money you have or what level of success you've enjoyed or earned in your life. But a lot of people, especially folks who are qualifying for these set aside licensing opportunities, have experienced trauma in a way that has, not put them in positions to be as competitive as what's wanted and needed. And so what we see is, like, across the country in retail and other businesses, people of color are operating those businesses, but they don't typically know how to access people like Lorine and her fund and be attractive enough to onboard capital or negotiate for real estate or, coordinate the supply chain. But they're managing, you go into any retail, from a drugstore to McDonald's to hotels all across the country, and by and large, you'll see people of color managing those multi-million-dollar businesses, but not owning, and not in the boardroom making those kinds of decisions. And so to be able to stand kind of in the in-between, to be able to create those opportunities and the systems and the guardrails like we do in the retail space, but to say, no, but now you're going to own, and then facilitate the financing and doing all of that is where I think it was unique to the experience, in the restaurant franchise space, but also to be able to help create the environment for people to be able to step up into the opportunity, overcome trauma, and then behave in a way that's consistent with leading a group of 20 or 25 people to operate in majority minority communities. I think that's the other thing about business and Black business or minority business is, in America, business is business. We're not trying to compete for 13% of the market share or 10% of the market share. We're trying to go to where there's the best opportunity to do the most business with this limited license. And I think that's what's so important for our folks to understand in this industry generally. It's like there's opportunities because we are, African American or Latino, or come from communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the application of criminal justice. But these are limited opportunities, and it's incumbent upon us to do the most with each one of those opportunities, to make the most money, be as successful as possible, and then reinvest in our communities, because that's the only way that we address the impact of the war on drugs and unfairness, institutional unfairness.
Really well put. Speaking about institutional or structural barriers, which you sort of laid out for us very well, I'm curious. One of the things I assume, I might be wrong, that you all have probably heard a lot throughout the course of your career and in this particular junction is, we would love to invest in diverse or sort of person of color led companies, but we don't know where to find these entrepreneurs. And whether that's because they didn't grow up at the country club sort of with them, or might not be in the social network, I think there's often considered a pipeline issue, which we know is sort of disproven. But, given that there might be people in the audience who are looking to invest in more diverse businesses, what are some tips and tricks you would have for people in terms of sourcing that talent and sourcing those opportunities? Lorine, maybe you kick it off.
Yeah, sure. Well, I just say stop looking where you're looking or change where you're looking. I mean, I hear this a lot. Oh, where do you find these entrepreneurs? And, there's so many incredibly quality companies that have approached us or we found, or people in our network. But I think for us, like I said, we're all women of color. And so we have a network, each of us, across the United States. And so we've been able to tap our network. If you look at, again, I'm talking about venture capital, traditional venture capital. If you look at VCs, it's pretty much like 95% white men. And so they've gone to the same schools. They've gone to MIT, Stanfords of the world. And that's their network. Or they've gone and worked at Facebook and different companies, and then they started a fund or whatever. And so, if you look at, just kind of their network looks like that. So I would say, if you're in the audience and you want to try to reach these entrepreneurs of color who are really talented that I mentioned, you need to go beyond your network. You need to connect with people of color who have access to this network. You need to go where these founders go and just really kind of expand your horizon. If you keep going to the same, watering hole, you're going to keep getting the same type of water. So, so I think just kind of go look at other ways and be creative and resourceful by doing that. I should say.
I would say, you have to know Lorine, and her colleagues. So, in the venture world, people share deal flow. So typically, like, one company is not taking out an entire round. Somebody needs $1 million on a $10 million valuation, a seed capital. Lorine is probably going to come in, if you guys do early stage at 250 to $500,000, maybe lead a round, take 25%, whatever that is of the round, with tag along rights. But Lorine is going to know, and there's a reason, and she's probably got the cultural competency to lead. And if there's an investor that is listening in, then I would be looking for the Lorines of the world and her colleagues to leverage as a resource to have access to deals that your network probably is not going to afford you. That's number one on the investor side. On the portfolio company side, I would say two things. If you have a company that deals in CBD or non-plant touching, there's a lot of alternatives that are available for you that aren't available for plant touching companies. One idea of which is now you're seeing what's called program related investments. So foundations right now in every city around the country, community foundations and others are looking for ways to improve outcomes in community through for-profit businesses. And so I would make sure I was civically engaged, understood what was going on in the foundation world and your local venture capital world, as well as your regional venture capital world, as well as, the usual suspects, who are primarily in New York, LA, San Francisco, Chicago, for venture. But don't forget foundations in the bigger nonprofit space who are looking for non-traditional ways to improve outcomes, especially through business, because results, we see the impact of business ownership improves health outcomes, educational attainment, and average household, and wealth creation.
Yeah, I love that. So we not only, traditional operators need to be investors need to be thinking outside the box, but also people who are bootstrapping or potentially, pre-revenue need to also be looking at alternative funds and types of resourcing. This panel is called Investing in sort of diverse brands and their founders. And like you all both mentioned, a lot of that investment is capital, like especially in the cannabis space, where it's so constrained and it's just not a particularly capital efficient business. But, it's also creating an environment in which founders and entrepreneurs of color feel comfortable and can succeed and are empowered to succeed. So, Lorine, I'm curious, you have a very diverse team that you work with, but I'm sure you've, either yourself or some of your portfolio companies have experienced issues when pitching other investors or with sort of working with operators. How would you say if a company is sort of not particularly diverse, but they're interacting with a more diverse entrepreneurial group, what are some ways that they can make sure that they're creating the most empowering sort of environment for those conversations and empowering their sort of portfolio companies to succeed?
So are you you mean within a brand or company that you're selling into, or just anything?
Anything. It could be whether it's an investment firm or whether it's within sort of operating company.
Yeah, so I'll talk about both of those. So investment firm, a VC, I think it's a group of us have been saying after everything that's happened, with Black Lives Matter movement, we just really said VCs have to really look at what they're doing, because so few companies of color getting funding. So we said, wire the money. So, send them the money and obviously do due diligence and invest in them, but then also hire. So wire and hire. And so look at your company and see like who works at your VC firm. And if it's all the same type of people, there's an issue with that, I think. So I'd say, think about like, what your place looks like, look in your own backyard. And then for brands, again, it's the same thing. Like look at your employee base. I really believe in, as I mentioned, it's to avoid these blind spots. You really need to have people with different perspectives. I'll give you an example. When Karim was talking earlier about how, African Americans and people of color, we're tastemakers in this country. Think about Instagram, and I don't know if people have heard of this whole Versus thing that Swiss Beats and Timbaland had launched during the pandemic. And they get these artists, like Jill Scott and Erykah Badu, or have this battle. It's friendly, they play their songs and their catalog, and they've had Instagram in some cases like broke Instagram, like they've never had so many people using Instagram Live. And so that just shows you, and I was thinking, this is great that they're doing that. Why don't they start their own platform? Why are they using Instagram? They don't need to use Instagram. These are all celebrities. Why not start your own platform? And so we're bringing all of this to this platform, and we're not making money off of it.
Mm-hmm.
So, but we have the cachet, So anyway, that goes with any kind of organization or company. You're missing I think you're missing the boat. You're missing a huge opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, to that end, I think McDonald's just did a deal with Travis Scott, and they're sold out of the Travis Scott meal. They can't keep quarter pounder meat in the stores right now. So it's like, it's crazy. Yeah, like what the impact of culture that we drive, really. The other thing is, like, I like to give, since I'm the beneficiary of relationships with venture capital firms who've invested in my company, kind of the portfolio company view of it, and some advice, which is like, know your needs, right? So when folks invest in companies, depending upon how much they invest as a part of your round, typically they're negotiating for board seats. Some are better at being involved in your business in ways that are additive versus ways that are punitive or hurtful or in the way. Get references. So find out, what other companies folks have been invested in, and talk to those CEOs about their experience with that company, what's been helpful and what hasn't been helpful. So know your value. And if there's typically, somebody who's willing to invest, or a venture firm that's willing to invest in your company, if you keep doing what you were doing in order to develop that relationship, there's other relationships too to develop. And so you're not stuck with, just, the first company that shows you some interest. And do a real assessment about, the strengths and weaknesses of your team, and be honest with folks, because your investor is your partner, and so you really want the help that you need, and you want to be able to articulate that and have a real open and honest relationship that lasts, hopefully for a good little while before you have a great exit. And so you have to approach it that way, as though you're going into something as a partner. And even if it's not a VC, and you're dealing with, more individualized investors that are out here trying to help fund people who get some of these licenses, recognize that anytime somebody gives you some money, it's somewhat of a marriage, and their ideas around the business, you have to really be clear about articulating who's responsible for what, who gets to make what decisions, and because that is the reason why most relationships break down, is because it wasn't articulated clearly, and the expectations weren't set forth at the beginning of those relationships. And and character matters. Don't just look at the money. Look at the human being and what you can possibly anticipate when adversity hits, because most of us, don't achieve what we're going to achieve without experiencing a significant amount of adversity. We're all operating in a startup environment. And so you need to be rolling with people that you can deal with, and that their character, which does reveal itself during adversity, is somebody you want to be dealing with during your own toughest times.
I love that. It is, sort of conceptualizing the investor-investee, relationship as a true relationship, and being very upfront and honest, being willing to sort of share your strengths and weaknesses. And then I think something that is sort of we're going to be kicked off in like 30 seconds, but I think the takeaway from this panel is know your worth and know their worth, I guess. So if you are an operator, make sure that you are 1,000% aware of what you're bringing to the table. Even if you may not have the same resume word by word as your more sort of your less diverse, I guess, partners, and then also making sure that the bigger companies who are investing know what POC-led companies are bringing to the table. Because a lot of times, in the case of Versus, it's the whole thing. It is the culture, it is the product, it is sort of the marketing and name recognition. So we need to make sure we have a very even relationship and a very respectful relationship. Well, Karim and Lorine, this has been amazing. I feel like I could listen to you both for hours, but I want you to continue doing what you're doing. So I want to make sure that you have time to get back to your day jobs. It's been such a pleasure, and I'm sure we will be in touch soon. I hope the audience enjoyed this, and be sure to continue to invest in the values that you all know are the right values, and you want to see perpetuated in America, especially in the business environment. So thank you.
Good to see you again, Natalie. Lorine, pleasure to see you. Look forward to connecting offline.
Same here. All right. Thank you, everyone.